It makes it sound like God's being fair if you just leave that part of Calvinism out. If you just don't talk about the sovereign decree of God to condition everyone to be haters from birth, yeah, it sounds like he's just passively leaving them to do their own will and their own desire. But that's not true Calvinism. It's not according to the confessions. It's not what they're saying with regard to the divine sovereign decree. Not if they hold to the T of tulip. There's always people in the side chat, there's people watching that say, oh, you're misrepresenting Calvinism, because they don't know what Calvinism is. Let's just be honest. There's a lot of self-proclaimed Calvinists who have no clue as to what Calvinism, qua Calvinism, properly defined by its leading scholars over the centuries, actually is. And I'm starting to think maybe Reformed Wiki somewhat fits into that category because of the way he has defined these terms. I didn't mean to jump ahead on that one, but I want to go back and look at that chart. So total depravity, he doesn't have right. He doesn't make a distinction of what the real T actually stands for. All he thinks that the T stands for is that people are born under the sinful condition of Adam and Eve. And again, that is not uniquely Calvinistic. We can all affirm we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We are all under the curse of sin. We all admit that, okay? The unique aspect of Calvinism says, because of that condition, even when the gospel is preached to you, even when the gospel is proclaimed to you clearly and the appeal of God is made to you, you will always hate it, you will always reject it because of the very condition you were decreed to have by God from birth. That is what Calvinism teaches, okay? You have to understand that, because a lot of people think, well, I'm a 2 or a 3 point Calvinist, but they don't understand what the point means. If you redefine the point, then you're not affirming a point of Calvinism. So stop saying I'm a 1 or a 2 point Calvinist. No, if you believe that you actually have the responsibility, the ability to respond to the gospel, then you're not a Calvinist at all, okay? Because the foundational point of Calvinism is that you are born unable to willingly, to desire to accept the gospel, even when it's made clear to you. If you don't affirm that, you're not a Calvinist. And that's why you have to actually give distinctives for what Calvinists actually say. And so I feel like I have to educate Calvinists on what Calvinism is in order for them to know whether they should reject it or not. Because some of them they've so watered down Calvinism and still call it Calvinism that it's not recognizable. It's not a distinctive of Calvin or Calvinism at all. And again, that's why I'm pushing back on it. Look at his definition of the U, unconditional election. God saves those he wishes, and then he calls it the concept of predestination. Okay. I love you, brother, but everybody believes God saves whoever he wishes. Okay? That's not a distinctive of Calvinism. God can save whoever he wants to save. Who does he want to save? These are the ones I look on with favor, those with a humble and contrite heart. God saves whoever he wishes. Who does he wish to save? Those who trust in him. You just happen to believe that God is the one who causes certain people to trust in him while decreeing everyone else to be born unable to trust in him. That's the difference between our two views. The difference between our two views is not the fact whether God saves who he wishes. Of course God saves whoever he wishes. The question is, do you have any responsibility in that? And we believe that you do. And therefore you're held blameworthy for your lack of faith or your lack of willingness to trust in him, because you could actually have done otherwise. So again, this is not a distinctive of Calvinism, and so it's a really bad definition. We believe in predestination. By the way, he mentions the concept of predestination. We believe in predestination. But what do we believe about predestination different than the Calvinist? Well, the Calvinist believes that certain people, unilaterally or arbitrarily picked before the foundation of the world, are caused to believe so as to be saved. We would say no, God has predestined that whoever believes will be saved. God is predestined for those who are in Christ Jesus through faith to be made holy and blameless and to be conformed to the image of Christ. That's the 2 times Paul uses the word predestination, is in Romans 8 and again in Ephesians 1. And both of them are about God predestining the faithful in Christ, those who are called, who love him and are called according to his purpose, according to Romans 8. Those are the ones he has predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. He has predestined them to be, quote unquote, holy and blameless. That's sanctification. That's being made into the image of Christ. And God has destined beforehand that whoever is in Christ will be made holy and blameless and to look like Christ. Just like I could say, the storm is coming. Whoever gets under the shelter will be saved. They are destined to be saved. Whoever remains outside the shelter is destined, will be lost or will be destroyed by the storm. Okay, just like with the blood on the doorpost. Whoever doesn't have the blood on the doorpost, their firstborn will be cursed. The death angel will come. If you do have the blood, he will pass over. It is destined beforehand. And therefore, anyone who perishes, who's outside of the shelter, you could rightly say they were predestined to perish. Now, the reason they were predestined to perish is because God predestined beforehand that whosoever doesn't trust in him or come under his shelter will surely perish. And you could also say everyone inside that shelter was predestined to be saved. Why? Because God predestined beforehand these blessings, the salvation of whoever is under his shelter. It says nothing about him predetermining whether you get under his shelter or not. And this is where Calvinists have just mistaken what predestination, biblical predestination, really is all about. It's God destining beforehand what will happen to those who are in Christ. That's the easiest way to understand it. Now, limited atonement. Look at what he says about limited atonement. This is the one that he actually, I think, gets remotely correct, if that makes sense. Christ died for the chosen only, not for everyone. That's the only one that's probably a pretty accurate description of one of the points in this whole list here. This is the only one he actually gets an actual distinctive of Calvinism right. Okay, the rest of them, in my estimation, you be the judge. He just doesn't get it. He just doesn't get any of them right because he doesn't give any true distinctive of Calvinism. For example, look at what he says about irresistible grace. God's grace is given freely, as if we don't agree with that. Of course, God's grace is given freely. He's not forced to give grace to anybody, okay? It cannot be earned or denied. Again, we agree with that because we don't believe faith earns salvation, okay? Which is exactly what we're going to get into later when he critiques Mike. We don't believe faith merits anything, okay? God graciously chooses to give salvation, to bless those who believe and trust in him. But faith itself is a filthy rag apart from the atoning work of Christ. And so we'll get into that. But notice what he says here is not distinctly or uniquely Calvinistic. All Christians could affirm that definition. Therefore, it's not a good definition. Perseverance of the saints. Look what he writes here. Those elected by God have full power to interpret the will of God. Again, we would agree with that because obviously we would say someone's elected who's in Christ, and those who are in Christ would have the ability to interpret the will of God or to interpret the scriptures to understand the will of God. So we would agree with that statement too, as it's stated. But I don't know what his ability to interpret the will has to do with perseverance. It seems that perseverance has more to do with those who are sealed in him by grace through faith, who are elected and irresistibly or effectually drawn to him, will remain in him, will not abandon that faith because they are elect. But again, I'm accused of not understanding Calvinism, but I think I have a better working definition of Calvinism than at least what's presented here by Reformed Wiki. And I think that's worthy of noting.
Unconditional election. Very controversial in itself, even apart from what Alan is about to describe next.
But then on the flip side, there is this doctrine called reprobation, and this is the idea that God chooses to pass over selecting certain people, thus leaving them in their sins, which means they will not be saved.
Right. If God chooses to save some, then naturally that means God has chosen to not save everyone else. But the key is that God's not unfair in doing this, because he is leaving them in their sins.
Okay, so leaving, I'm backing up right there. They deserve the punishment, it says. Leaving, he says they're leaving them in their sins. Okay, let's watch that.
Naturally, that means God has chosen to not save everyone else. But the key is that God's not unfair in doing this, because he is leaving them.
Okay, so he's leaving them in their sins. Okay, this makes it sound like God did not decree for the fall, which we just read Calvin saying that he did decree that the fall would happen. It also makes it sound like God didn't decree the condition of all mankind because of that fall. In other words, Was it just some happenstance or accident that all the posterity of Adam from that point forward became God haters from birth who would always say no to God and the gospel? Is the result of the total depravity, as defined by Calvinists, as being this inability to willingly to want to come to God? Is that an accident, or is that something God divinely decreed? So just quote unquote leaving them in their sins isn't really a good picture of what Calvinists actually mean. What it should be saying, he has decreed them to remain in their sins and to desire their sins from birth, innately. They can't help it. They will always love their sin and hate the gospel because that's what God created them to be and to do by design. He's the one who did it. He's the one who decreed it. And so it makes it sound like God's being fair if you just leave that part of Calvinism out. If you just don't talk about the sovereign decree of God to condition everyone to be haters from birth, yeah, it sounds like he's just passively leaving them to do their own will and their own desire. But that's not true Calvinism. It's not according to the confessions. It's not what they're saying with regard to the divine sovereign decree. Not if they hold to the T of tulip. And that's why we keep pointing this out to Calvinists. Calvinists, you can't have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. You can't just ignore your doctrines of sovereign decree, of all things being decreed by God. You can't ignore the actual claim of T and expect us just not to say something to you about it. Again, I say this in love to my brother. I hope that you see the error of your ways in my rebuke of you on this regard, because you're not just saying God is passively just letting people freely, libertarianly freely choose their sinful ways, because that's not what any true Calvinist teaches or believes. A true Calvinist, at least according to the best scholars, believe that you're born in a condition by divine decree that you will always hate and reject the gospel. And you've got to say that in order for your audience to be able to judge whether what you're saying is actually a biblical concept or not.